uh, welcome to the next session. Yeah, we've been making some interesting progress around ownership and control. So, just to recap, over the last couple of sessions, 19th December and then again last week, we looked at extending from the basic, simple kinds of relationships that we previously established, which were voting shareholding based relationships, into other kinds of control and other kinds of ownership. So we looked at partnerships in order to work out what were the possible abstractions, if any, between the kind of ownership structures that exist there and the kind that exist in limited companies. And of course, there was the question of incorporated partnerships versus non-incorporated partnerships and so on. So we had a lot of Venn diagram type of thinking around different kinds of equity and different kinds of control. So I think there's two or three things that I'd like to try and get a handle on this week. As I mentioned in the invitation, one of those is this concept of a voting shareholding company. This is a shareholder which is itself a company, which we currently have, rightly or wrongly, as the ancestor of things like parent, significant part owner, and so on. So we have, parent is something with 50% or more controlling shares, so that's voting ownership, of course. Part owner is between some interesting threshold like 5% and up to the 50%. And I've added one here from the work that David Newman's team has been doing on operational ontologies, which is a total owner, where you have a wholly owned subsidiary where one entity owns 100% of the other entity. Now, of course, where you have 100% ownership, it goes without saying that it's ownership and control, because if you own all the shares, then you own all the controlling shares. So we've sort of been dealing with possibly a minority case for clarity, which is that not all shares are voting shares. Realistically, most of them are. And so the other thing I want to get to grips with is when we talk about percentages of ownership, agnostic to whether it's with control or not, are we still interested in things like 50% plus one ownership, regardless of control, for different regulatory requirements? I've heard suggestions, for example, in the FATCA tax regulations about entities or people, for that matter, owning more than a given percentage of some entity. I may have got that wrong, and I'd be interested in people's input on that. So there's really maybe three things I want to cover this week. One is these concepts of parent and subsidiary and so on, and significant part owner, which we framed very much as being control relationships based on the ownership of controlling shares, in order not to assume anything more than we knew, we made the basis of those parent and subsidiary type of relationships an owner of a holder of voting shares, which is itself a limited company. Now, I think I'm just going to go to another diagram here to show this. I think that this, so here it is again, voting shareholding company that's ancestral to parent and part owner and so on, is a controlling relationship because it's based on the holding of voting shares, and the thing which is potentially a parent or part owner is itself a company. Now, I'd like to know, firstly, I suspect that we would call something a parent even if it's another kind of entity. For example, if it's any kind of body corporate, that's any kind of incorporated entity, or possibly even if it's any kind of formal organization, which would include trusts and non-incorporated partnerships and so on. I suspect, and I'd like to know whether, if, of course, the owner of any shares, including voting shares, can be any potential party. It could be a formal organization, a human being, and so on. Most of those, I presume, we would not call those parent. We only talk about parent in the context of the company. So I want to see if we can elevate this this identity relationship, that which can be a voting shareholding company, that which is ancestral to parent and part owner and so on. Maybe these need to be dealt with separately, but I'd like to suggest that this identity relationship needs to go somewhere further up the chain. So when we call something a parent, when we talk about something being a subsidiary of something, what is the full range of the kinds of things we talk about? Should it be formal organisation? So if a trust holds more than 50% shares, voting shares in something, is that trust regarded as a parent? What sort of things are or are not regarded as parent? So that's the first and perhaps the simplest question I want to look at. After that, I'd like to go on to look at ownership relationships. We've talked about parent and subsidiary and so on as being de jure control relationships based on the holding of voting equity. Now, of course, most equity is voting equity, most shares are voting shares, and so I wonder when we talk about somebody having 50% ownership of something, whether that is itself interesting or whether it's actually controlling ownership that's interesting, or whether perhaps some data feeds might talk about ownership without saying whether it's controlling ownership or not, and we want to be clear what assertions are and are not being made in that context. So that's the other thing I want to go on to, and then after that there's a little bit of review I want to do on some of the stuff we did last time on different kinds of equity, equity with and without control and so on, in terms of different kinds of entity. And I also had some very good comments from the folks over at UCC, which I'll look at that point. So those are the three things I want to cover. So let's start with the simple one. If we call something a parent, if we call something a part owner, if we call something a wholly owned subsidiary and so on, those relationships are based on the holding of voting shares by some kind of company or some kind of entity. When do we use or not use the terms like parent and so on? What kind of entity can be the basis of those kinds of relationships? Anybody have any insights into that? I think probably the quickest way to is to put something either in the questions queue.
Mike, Chris Taggart.
Hello.
Chris, I've released your line. You're on voice over IP. Can you be heard?
Yeah, I hope so.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So the coincidentally, we were actually looking at that this morning in the context of some Federal Reserve hierarchy data, and the question is what that was saying, and what that seemed to be saying, because that's to do with a bank holding company, and what a bank holding company is, and what a bank holding company means. Now, the last time I actually posted a definitions thing, which is the US federal definitions, and it actually has some useful definitions in here that guided us in this, and that I think will be useful. Now, I will try to post that again now, but I'll also read out the what it actually says. So if I can post this if I post it as a question, Mike, is that okay?
Yeah.
The link, and then maybe you can share that.
Oh yes. Yeah, that was I couldn't follow the link while it was in the chat thing, and I was
no, absolutely.
The spreadsheet and then follow it. I'm really sorry I've been.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
So we were looking at the hierarchy information for banks, and that's collected by the Federal Reserve, and it said, and there's a definition of bank holding companies. So the first thing is what exactly was it meaning by hierarchy, and what does the nature of this relationship mean, and so on. And there are some notes in there, but what was the general one, absent of any notes? And it says bank holding company. The term bank holding company means a person meaning person in the widest sense, which is engaged either directly or indirectly, primarily in the business of owning securities of one or more banks for the purpose and with the effect of exercising control. Now, and then the other one that's really of interest is subsidiary. and and again we were looking at subsidiaries because we've been mapping subsidiary information from the SEC and also shareholding information, and this comes down to the effect of when we're talking about subsidiary parents, these sorts of things. Are we talking about ownership or are we talking about control? And could we be talking about are the two inextricably linked, or can and should they be separated?
Yeah.
So the SEC, for example, the filing requirements for the SEC is to do with significant subsidiaries. You have to list your significant subsidiaries, and there's a W on that link that I've given on the definitions. It talks about significant subsidiaries, and there are various thresholds there. About the percentage, 10% of common stock, or various other things. But a subsidiary is actually a very simple one, which is definition Y on that page, and it says a subsidiary of a specified person is an affiliate controlled by such person directly or indirectly through one or more intermediaries. Now, the interesting thing there is this nature of that defines subsidiary in terms of control rather than ownership. Now, an affiliate, it's one of these ones where you have to go follow all the definitions. An affiliate of or person affiliated with a specific person is a person that directly or indirectly through more intermediaries controls or is controlled by or is under control with the person specified. So again, that doesn't talk about ownership, that talks about control. So my reading of this US federal definition, which informs the SEC and also the Federal Reserve and other official US government financial information, is that the subsidiary information, bank hold, and also it does define parent here. It says a parent of a specified person is an affiliate controlling such person directly or indirectly through one or more intermediaries. So my reading of this, and I think this is probably a sensible thing to do, because you could, as we've discovered in the Financial Stability Board work, it's quite feasible to have no equity ownership but 100% control through a contractual mechanism. So what they're talking about, what this is talking about, is the parents and subsidiaries being about control and not about equity. So you could have full control and have no equity. You could have full equity and no control. And so I think the two things are so it may be that if you know that this company owns equity, 100% of the equity, or 51% of the equity, or whatever the figure is, and that there is no other riders and other things, that you can then infer control from it. But it becomes almost a data source for a control relationship rather than the parent or subsidiary being a corollary or automatically flowing from that equity relationship. Does that make sense?
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I've taken several things out of that. So I've jotted those down because I think it's sometimes quicker to capture the essentials of it. There's two or three things then. Firstly, every one of these relationships relates to control. Secondly, every one of them relates to basically any kind of legal person, although since you can't own human beings and haven't been able to since I think 1954 was the last country that banned it, surprisingly recent. A lot of the mechanisms they're talking about necessarily only apply to something else in our universe of things besides legal person, but the definitions are very explicitly talking about legal person, which is interesting, particularly since it excludes things that don't have legal personhood. Second thing I take from this is that the control they're talking about need not be equity-based, but may include contractual, but in both cases I would assume is de jure control. Let's have a look at our control. Let's find the right diagram for the moment.
Yeah, Mike.
Yep.
Yeah, Mike, this is Jeff Braswell. That's why we distinguish between voting shares and economic shares.
Chris, is that definition in the FRY 9C documents, or where is that definition from the?
So I've pasted it in the questions. I don't know, Mike, if you can paste it anywhere that everyone else can see this. It's basically under it's a long URL. Maybe I can post it as a bit.ly URL or something, and I can just put that on the screen.
I'll tell you what, if you post it in the chat, for some reason the questions log, I don't get to be able to use it as a link or cut and paste it until I see a spreadsheet afterwards. But if you look at chat, it should be right at the bottom of your if you maximize little thing on this.
I actually can't find the chat thing.
Is chat available to attendees or only to organised?
You got to hit the plus sign and extend it. It's on the very bottom.
Ah.
There it is.
I just sent it on the chat. There you are.
Wonderful. And that should, if you just when it loads, it takes quite a long time to load, but it should take you directly to the definition section. That link.
Right. Let me just try to jot that. And economic.
Yeah, you can have beneficial economic shares or voting shares. They can be different types of shares.
Yep.
It's kind of the same distinction.
Yeah, good. So we hadn't used the term economic shares, but that's going to help me with the next bit of the thing I was after. Now I'm going to go to that chat thing. It should be, here we go. And now I can use it as a link. So this is the slow machine. Here it comes. Right. So, and this ties into another.
You got to scroll down, Mike. It's somewhere in the middle of the document.
Right. Just waiting for it to
under definitions.
And under definitions, the terms related to internal control over financial reporting. We have affiliates, directly, indirectly, through one or more immediate controls, or is controlled by, or is under common control with. So I tried to write that down and I wrote it down slightly wrong. Where was that? Is under common. Because actually somebody was asking about affiliate the other day and I had no idea what to do with it. Okay, so then amount, audit, these appear to be alphabetic. Equity, security, fiscal year. So economic shares aren't defined here, that's okay. 50% owned person, there's a nice term if ever there was one. A person approximately 50% of whose outstanding voting shares is owned by the specified person, either directly or indirectly. Right, so this is, now here's the point, we've been using the word parent, and different people seem to interpret parent differently. Would it actually be better, since this actually means a 50% owned person based on voting shares, I see it does say shares, it should say voting shares, because that's what it's modelled as. Would it make more sense to label this in accordance with the definition we just saw, a 50% owned person, so that it would have some clarity, or is that reasonably clearly understood as being what parent means?
Well, the term parent has the obvious difficulty in that you could have, once again, a nuclear family, or you could have a commune.
Right. You're thinking about things like joint ventures and stuff, you mean?
Exactly. Parent, you can have three parents who have 1/3 control.
And you would still use the word parent in that case?
You could.
That's
I'm
why
just
it's a
saying that
bad word to use.
it's just a bad
Right.
word to use. That's all.
Thank you. Good. So that answers my question. Is this a bad word to use? Yes, it is.
Well,
Fantastic.
can I just the other thing is just this word. There's a definition in G of control, and when you look at the parent definition here, it talks about controlling, and what many people might think of controlling is the fact of is actually having the power to say without anybody essentially stopping you from doing it. Now that's actually quite problematic, because even if you own 70% of the shares, then you've still got minority shareholders still have rights to block things under certain types of things. It depends on all sorts of articles of association and things like that. But G actually defines control, which is the term control means possession, direct or indirect, of the power to direct or cause the direction of the management and policies of a person, whether through ownership of by voting shares by contract or otherwise. So it's a question of direction of the management as opposed to, and that's one of the reasons why I would think that you could have 39% of the shares and cause the direction of it. So essentially control it. So I don't think it should be about, I think control shouldn't be about the percentage. I think control should be about the ability to direct, essentially.
Right, capability.
Right.
Yeah.
Isn't that the de facto control as distinct from de jure control?
Yeah. That's true, yeah.
Mike, there's also a couple of comments on the questions from Con Crowley and also from Coates.
Right, wonderful. So it sounds like we have, yep.
Sorry, just to say I've released both your lines so you can join in.
Okay, so Con Crowley, you have a couple of comments in the session queue. Are you there?
He's muted himself, Con.
Okay. Maybe he's not able to unmute. Are you able to unmute yourself, Con? Or are you you're showing as being muted at your end at the moment? Okay, I'll read your comments out. So, look to the Bank Holding Act, Part 223, Regulation W, and Part 225, Regulation Y, the US banking sector definitions. Okay, and that's definitions of these concepts we're talking about now, I presume. So I'll have a look. Regulation W, yes, there's been some interesting conversations about that in the OMD groups as well, and that seems to relate to equity. Yeah, I'll have a look at that. Also, FRB regulations, Part 215.2, which is Regulation O. And in the US, CFTC, FDIC, OCC, and the Fed all start with a 25% target, and then they all differ from here. Yes. And that, I think, comes back to the question of these different levels of ownership, how many of them, if any, we want to define, and basically it's a two-way thing. It's when we can say that person X or party X has this or that control, or this number of voting shares, or this number of shares in something, what do we infer from that? But also when you get a data feed that comes in saying this is a wholly owned subsidiary of that, what assertion is being made, and is it talking about each of the three kinds of controls we just looked at, only de jure control, only shares, and so on. So yeah, I think we need to look at all of those. But
when you're doing a query, Mike, wouldn't it be possible to structure this by percentage and then just define the bands of percentages you want? It wouldn't help your second part, but it certainly would help your first part.
This is Con Crowley. Am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are.
Very good. All right, so I wasn't excuse me, posing questions as much as trying to enter the conversation, just to cite what are some of the federal regulations, all stemming from the Bank Holding Company Act, that start with the 25%. They refer to classes of voting securities, and then individual regulations from the various agencies start to differ from there, but it's at the levels below that, and some of their wording is a little bit different. But that seems to be, where their starting point is. To Mike's point, Mike, you were asking about being able to select the percentage and move from there.
Yeah.
If you think about how do you know what those ownership percentages are, and I believe it's the SEC that has a requirement once you go above 5% ownership, you need to report that.
Right.
What would be the mechanics of being able to, on a real-time basis, determine based on current trades and shares outstanding what any given entity's control is? It seems to be a very difficult concept to try to address. And in practical application, how would you actually do that without knowing all the trades in the marketplace, without knowing all the positions, the current amounts outstanding? And is it practical to try and do this on an almost real-time basis? Does it really require that that there's a regulatory requirement for reporting of percentage ownership on some kind of frequent basis?
Well, I think the only way to do it, Con, would be by a regulatory mandate.
Yeah, but so you're not relying on deriving this at any particular point in time. You're basically relying on what you've been told.
Correct.
Well, that's the point for the 5% ownership is obviously to get you in the ballpark of where you might be. You might add up to being significant or have some controlling aspect in board meetings. I mean, this is a Carl Icahn type of calculation. When do I have control? When can I do something with shareholders? So I think the distinction should be made between recording facts about ownership and then doing calculations and derivations about roll-ups. I agree, Con, that one cannot, just like Carl Icahn doesn't know if he's got all the votes or not. It's difficult from a strict calculation of public shares to know when such controlling situations exist or not, certainly when they're at the bubble. But the one thing we don't want to do is to simply limit the recording of facts to if you're above a certain threshold like 25 or 50, then you get recorded, because at that point you mask out all the possibilities for adding up, say, 6 shareholders that have 8, 9 or 10% control and having a majority pool.
That's right. I agree.
That's a good point. Yeah. And since here we're defining the meaningful concepts, regardless of whether they're practical or whether you can infer this from that or what's recorded or not recorded, I think if there's something which is of interest, or if there's something that may be available in some data and therefore applies some meaning, we should be able to say what it is that's being asserted. So I have a hunch, I may be right or wrong, that sometimes when you look at a data feed that says, this has got 40% ownership in that, you may not know whether it means ownership or voting ownership. But most of the formal definitions, as we've seen, do relate specifically to control. And what surprised me slightly, they relate to all types of legal persons for which such a control might exist, including those for which there might only be contractual but still de jure control versus those that are share ownership. So that starts to give us something we can generalize up the chain. Some of the stuff around voting shares, of course, will only apply to things that have voting shares, which is incorporated companies. So this comes back to the same question about other kinds of thing, where only the other kinds of control, like contractual control or the controlling equity that is conferred on general partners in a partnership, incorporated or otherwise.
So, Con, when they report, do they have to report against this 25% threshold that's in the Bank Holding Company Act? When they say I have control over,
there's the additional scrutiny that it undergoes to see whether that 25% is the determining factor for what is control. There's a much finer degree that they go to, and it's in part of the National Information Center, the NIC, that the Federal Reserve Board runs, where it's reported in those percentages, but they go down all the way to the 5% level. And there are, if you look at the Bank Holding Company Act, they also have, and the Federal Reserve Board's regulation, they also go to an 11% level that they talk about. So they're once you get below just a straight view at 25%, it becomes more complicated, and each agency gets a little more complicated in how they look at it. And it can almost be described as, look, if it's less than 25%, there's also our judgment that yes, you in fact have a controlling interest.
Yes, and actually, some of the if you look at the NIC, some of the NIC listings, it'll actually say in the footnotes, this is below this threshold, but we consider it a view of interest, things like that as well. So there is a judgment call there allowed, it seems to be as well, on that NIC data.
Right, and so that would you say that's what we meant earlier when we talked about de facto control, that to determine de facto control is something.
Well, I would go back to Jeff's perspective, which is that there's there's two things here. There's one is the data, giving the information, and the other is a question of the influence and the control that exerts. And excuse me, it's quite easy to come up with situations where where you are on that bubble, and there are plenty of situations and examples in the corporate world, and where actually it's not clear whether you have control until you try to exercise it. Can you get rid of a director? Yes, you can get rid of a director, but can you actually can you do a takeover, for example? So control can also be related to a specific time, specific action as well. So I think this is why it's difficult, and I think the fundamental things in terms of some of the hierarchy stuff that's going on in the FSP, certainly the PSPG, are really focused on getting some data out there, and then it's much easier to make a judgment call about what that data means and how that's going to be, because you can look at it in context. Whereas if it's just a question of, okay, this controls this or whatever, then well, maybe it doesn't, maybe it doesn't. It's very difficult to exactly say what is going to happen in that situation. Mostly these things, as I understand it, and probably Con can clarify this a bit, but or expand on this a bit. But mostly this is down to a lot of this is, certainly the SEC stuff is down to self-reporting, and the question, and there is a whether you control something, and it is a question of you have to report whether you control it, but there may be trouble, or then you are expected, and it's in the rules that you have reported it. If you found not to report it, then presumably there is some sort of sanction there. But I think when you were talking about control, it's expected to be, to a degree, self-reported, I think.
Right, and that brings me to another question. I meant to put this into the agenda at the beginning, which is that when people file information with the SEC or with other regulators in their various jurisdictions, what are the things they may or may not be asserting? Are they simply aiming to reflect the kinds of facts we've already talked about here around voting, share ownership, and so on? Or are they reflecting additional facts which are not reflected anywhere else? For example, common accounting, group accounting, and so on. Or do those always go hand in hand? I need to catch up with, I think, some of the questions in the questions queue and the chat, though, before I come back to that question. So, right, Tony Coates, is your line unmuted?
Should be, yeah.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm saying is what I wrote is probably not so different, but just to reiterate what last week, that any of these rules like 50% or 25% or 11%, we do need to keep that out of our base model. We can model ownership, and if there are ways we can model control, then that's fine. Yep. But some of those other boundaries that are really more to do either with laws or with market conventions, we could have a model of the law or of the market convention, but I don't think we should build those things into any of our core definitions, because they're just going to change at some point when somebody changes their mind.
Yeah, we had earlier comments on that as well, didn't we? That these bands and thresholds, should we be modelling them or not? And I think from some of the other comments, I'm starting to think we should. I think what we said last time was no, we would not. But then we're still left with what does it mean to be a parent, a significant part owner, and so on. I guess, I'm thinking out loud here, but I guess that whatever could be asserted, there needs to be the kinds of concepts in the model you can point to say that's what was asserted. But
well, I think one of the things about the control thing is that the control is based on the context really, and so that if, for example, that let's say that we wanted to expose we import the data from the NIC and we want to export that as data. We want to be able to describe that. Then what we'd want to be able to say is that there is a just ignoring some of those ones with notes and things like that for the moment, but there is a control relationship here using this definition, and the definition of a control is this one, if you like, whatever that
exactly. Yeah.
And so we wouldn't want to say what control meant in that context, but we'd want to refer it to somebody else's definition of that if you see what I mean. So we wouldn't want the ontology to say what control meant. We'd want to say that control means control, if you see what I mean.
Well, yeah, I can fine tune that slightly. I think in an operational ontology where you only want classes that there's going to be data for, you certainly wouldn't have data for things, these abstract concepts like de jure control and de facto control. But they are real things in the world. They are modeled in the conceptual ontology, and by having them there, you can then say you can segregate two data feeds and say this one is talking about percentage of ownership agnostically to control, and that one is talking about percentage of control, and we shouldn't try and reason over these two sets of data as though they mean the same thing, because we're using this relationship to a non-operational concept, which is in the ontology, to say once and for all, this is what this data means. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think if you've got something like this one is modeling percentage control, then the percentage is an attribute essentially, and what that means is that you're not saying it controls because it's got this percent. It's like this controls and it has this percentage. If you see what I mean.
Yeah, there would be cases contractually in which you could say you could enter into a contract in which in exchange for certain goodwill or consideration, you would be granted a percentage of control as an actual outright term of a contract. That would differ than if you were simply doing a calculation saying based upon other facts it looks as if you have a certain percentage control.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, if somebody has asserted there's some control based on some contract, then you can see that having X percent of voting shares isn't going to cut it.
Well, in those cases, the percentage mechanism would replace the share mechanism, and it would be a broader, a cruder brush and a smaller partnership of sorts. So, this is why in the conceptual model that we were also looking at with voting shares and economic shares, we're also looking at defining things in terms of percentages as contractual terms. In terms of maybe I have an option to exercise that would give me another 5% control, whatever that might mean. And that was just for the purpose of logical completeness, as opposed to a specific example.
The percentage control, with or without share ownership, it can be. So the kind of de jure control that can be formally defined in a contract can include percentages. Yes, that would make sense, wouldn't it?
Sure, if you have a small partnership of 5 or 6 people, you might in fact have part of the terms of the contract might say that this person has 30% of beneficial profits, but they have 50 or 60% share, of control of in terms of weight, in terms of voting.
Right. So this would be in a partnership agreement.
Correct.
Which would identify. I started putting some terms in for this, but I haven't filled in much of the detail. Which identify beneficial ownership and control ownership as two distinct things.
Right.
So, Jeff, are you saying there's no restrictions on the contractual extension of control that can be created?
Well, I'm just saying that not in the world, let's say, of public share-owned companies, but certainly in the private sector, one can do just about anything one wants in a contract.
Indeed. And just to make sure I've understood that, we talked there about the partnership agreement because we used the example of partnership while keeping it general, but there could also be some other contracts. It need not necessarily be a partnership we're talking about, and it need not necessarily therefore be in a partnership agreement. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, once again that's a potentially double use of a confusing aspect of the word partnership, because in one sense the term partnership, as distinct from corporate reporting, indicates a flow-through of liability and income expense purposes in the classical sense. At the same time, a partnership can be two or three people that decide that they are elect to do something together by an ad hoc agreement that has nothing to do with accounting principles.
Right. And presumably, you can have a contract. Can you have a contract in an incorporated company, a limited company? Can you have a contract with some individual that gives them some control that overrides the control exercised by voting shareholders, or is that simply impossible?
No, if it's part of the charter, it's certainly possible. One can craft a charter. It would probably face a challenge at some point if someone objected to that as being something that was not valid in the legal framework of the jurisdiction. But certainly one could create that situation.
Right. So de jure contractual control, which overrides.
I mean, in one sense, you can look at political organizations in terms of things like parliaments as being an example of this phenomenon. You don't know if you have control until the votes come in, and you are officially you form you don't have majority, but then you form a coalition. Now you have control, or perhaps technically you could say that a group has control over the voting votes in a electoral situation, but they instead of electing to do something by virtue of that, they might cede to the wise countenance of a figurehead, such as the King of Thailand, who might urge the legal authority to do something, and in fact exert control in a way that's not even specifically part of the voting mechanism.
Right. Now, I think, is that going beyond what we can model, i.e. beyond what would be asserted in anybody's data, and therefore we need to think about the meaning of?
Yes, we easily can go beyond what we can describe from a data gathering point of view by any number of these human situations that are going to defy us.
Yeah. And I think one of the things, I think that's a good point as well, Mike, in terms of, one of the critical things is to model the data that we've got, and some of these things, and particularly to do with control and so on, is actually not probably not knowable exactly what is the situation. So let's say that you have a shareholding of 39%. Well, that is not, it's not knowable, in absence of knowing the situation. It may not be knowable until it comes to a head, and or even in a court or something. Let's say we're talking about liability or things like that. It may not be knowable exactly what's happening until it comes to a court that rules on it. And I think one of the things is that there's many situations where, not just in this situation, but in the rest of the world, when we're modeling things where the answer isn't knowable until it's ruled by a court or something like that. And so I think the modeling the data that we've got and that we need to express is a good benchmark.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's an interesting in the artificial intelligence world, they would go so far as to say that a term doesn't have any meaning until it's challenged in court. But from the point of view of business entities and securities and regulatory purposes generally, it's sort of not enough to to say that nothing has a meaning till it's challenged in court, because we want to at least say what it could mean or what's asserted. But keep in mind at the back of our minds that from the pure AI practitioner's point of view, it's when the rubber hits the road that you actually know what the implication of something was.
Well, this gets
we want to map facts, and when the courts decide there are new facts, we'll map new facts.
Exactly.
But this gets to the heart of the entire risk management exercise, because if you think about the types of things that are done, and this information in general is being sought after, is the fact that you're looking at the concept, for example, of the probability of default. And probability of default is used as a calculation, in fact, that that can arrive at a pretty distinct discount premium of value. However, one either defaults or does not default, and so therefore the concept of a probability of default is based upon some calculation of what is the likelihood of that. And to a degree, one of the reasons that these facts about ownership and control are being gathered would be to be in a better position to infer what are the likelihoods that certain things could happen, as opposed to ruling things out that could probably not happen.
Yes, and not only that, but you know, in an ontology that covers all of the kinds of concepts out there, that includes things like probabilities, which are a kind of mathematical construct, which are a kind of thing. So you can talk about the probability of a thing while talking about the thing. We shouldn't get that mixed up with what you can or can't do in an application. I think that's
right, but by probability I mean more of the frequentist aspect of measuring things that happen, as opposed to the classical interpretation of saying that there is a 1/6 probability of a die falling on one side based upon the classical. So
yes, because you can talk about that semantically without having to model it mathematically. Good. So yeah, so I think what we're looking at is that some of these terms and these regulations explicitly talk about a range of things that fall under that, like a logical union, a sort of set theoretic union of equity-based control plus contractual control. It's a nice union of concepts. We get all the concepts in place, and then we can describe these regulations with reference to those kind of logical unions and intersections and so on, provided that we have generalized everything suitably. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one could sort of take this back to the example of of Lehman Brothers bellying up over the weekend because, in fact, Barclays was prevented from actually going through with the agreement because they were enjoined from not doing so by the Bank of England.
Yes, that was
I mean, all the way down to that level of who has control over the outcome of a significant situation when, in fact, you're trying to line up all of the other factors that you think will get you control.
Yes, and ultimately, nobody knew what the outcome was, and if we had more detailed semantics of the underlying facts, at least somebody could have, either by looking at it, maybe even some visualization technique, maybe automated reasoning, maybe human judgment, when applied to all the facts that are known, one can then arrive at sensible knowledge beyond that.
True, as long as those would be, once again, the likelihoods or probabilities of knowing things that might happen, because it's more of an inductive science than a deductive science.
Exactly, yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, but keep yourself in the realm of reality here, Mike. Map the things you can map.
Yep. So, good. So just going back to the questions queue, Con Crowley said he has to drop off briefly. I don't know if you're back yet, but he says that the regulations, this 25% that we talked about a little bit earlier, explicitly speaks to any class of voting securities. So in other words, it explicitly speaks of securities, but it explicitly speaks of voting securities. So we're definitely talking about control each time. So going back to my other question then, and then we'll come back to this this question about the range of parent and so on. But the other question I wanted to talk about was when we talk about kinds of the bands that are of interest, the things we can formally say, like part owner and significant owner and so on. We say those in this hierarchy of control parties, the voting shareholder, voting shares, everything we've looked at in this whole diagram has come back to control, either voting shares or contract-based de jure control. So is there or isn't there any interest in different kinds or levels of ownership that is agnostic to control? So at the moment, under ownership, we've certainly defined, beneficial owner versus registered shareholder, public versus private shareholders, voting shareholders, which bring us into the control realm. But are there scenarios in which either A, we're interested in different levels of ownership that are agnostic to control, we've seen none so far, or B, are there data feeds that would assert levels of control agnostically, and therefore we have to not get them confused with assertions of voting control, or not? So at the moment, I just...
So I think yes to both of those in terms of so one of the information that we're now collecting and starting to show on open corporates is shareholder information and actually the number of shares or the percentage of shares that they own, and that is reported for different types of companies. In New Zealand, they report it for all the companies, and we're hopeful we might get that in the several other jurisdictions as well. Other ones do it for significant size companies. Other ones do it in terms of percentages rather than or whether they're a majority. So Quebec, for example, publishes a majority. So they are talking about shareholding, and that doesn't. And although there may be an implication about control, that actually doesn't say that the register is talking about shareholding, and you wouldn't know if a company had a side contract or some other mechanism for control other than that shareholding, because it's just reporting the shareholding. So one is in terms of going back to that thing of modeling the data that is there, and certainly that data is useful to us, and I suspect to other people as well, because you may be able to infer control from that. Now that inference may be high quality or low quality, but nevertheless it's something that is, if you've got 100% or even if you've got 70% or even 51% of shares, you would think, in absence of any other information, I would make the assumption that that is the case. It may be a wrong assumption to make, but it's a pretty good first assumption to take.
Right.
So one is in terms of that there is data that's published on shareholder, and actually, you can get shareholder information from UK companies by visiting in person or by making application to the company register. So and then the second thing is in terms of whether there is not accuracy, but the detailed level of the reporting. I mean, it's very frequent to say. So when you look at the SEC data, for example, that's significant subsidiaries, and that significant subsidiaries based on what that company says. So Lehman Brothers had whatever 200 or 300, I think it was 301 subsidiaries out of their, reported based on out of 2,985 legal entities. So they're reporting that. Now, if it stops being there, but they're not actually saying, in most cases, those SEC filings don't say, in most cases, they actually don't say whether that's a direct or an indirect holding or what the nature of that subsidiary relationship is. They don't say whether that is contractual or, although it could be contractual under those definitions, they don't say whether it's necessarily equity-based or some other based, or whether they are what percentage of voting shares, or they're through voting shares or some other mechanism. So I think that it's highly likely, in fact, it may even be the most common case that we have a incomplete reporting of this nature of control and the relationships in general.
Right, thank you. It certainly does. So we can say what a given piece of data does or doesn't assert, and that includes, this is the question that I wanted to come back to anyway, which is what goes in reportings and filings what sort of assertions are made, and what you're saying is that they will assert some kind of control without saying what kind of control it is. Will they, by virtue of putting that in a report, will that necessarily be de jure control, or can it be, and that people won't report like vague kinds of influence and stuff like that, will they? Or,
well, I don't know about vague kinds of influence, but it could be. So my reading of those definitions again, and you know, I'm not a lawyer, and I've only been looking at those definitions for the last week or 2 weeks or something like that. So bearing with those provisos in mind, my reading of those definitions is that they could be rather than de jure, because if you have de facto control of an entity, then I would think that would come under those definitions.
right. So entities should be reporting de facto control.
That's my reading of it. But as I said, I'm not a lawyer.
Right. Any lawyers on that?
Not a lawyer, but one thing that does need to be recorded, if in fact it exists, and taken into consideration, are the situations where optionality and the ability to exercise options or warrants at a key time will allow those people who can avoid being considered to be in a controlling relationship to exercise control at when it's convenient to do so.
So that's the warrant that gives you, if you exercise it, you get an ordinary share or something which comes with voting rights.
Yeah, you have options. You have options on voting shares or warrants on those shares that you can exercise, and at the time that you do exercise them, you can gain control.
Yeah.
Apparently, this is a technique that is being used in certain types of vehicles where perhaps the parties involved are trying to not reveal or have disclosed that they have this degree of control, but they do because they can, when necessary, exercise that control by voting their options.
Yeah, and my understanding is that in the UK, and again, this is an incomplete and an informed layperson's view, if you like. My understanding is that the takeover rules in the UK changed about, I don't know, somewhere between 1 and 3 years ago, so that there had to be disclosures because there were a number of situations where takeovers stakes were being built up via options rather than to, which meant that the triggers weren't being set off essentially. So I think that those options now need to be disclosed because of that situation, in as far as the UK takeover rules go.
Yeah. So that's the conditional future control. Ouch. Yes. We've got a model of options somewhere, but as to let me just clear out this box. Interesting.
Well, I would almost say that was still control, because that is control that hasn't yet been proven, if you see what I mean, in terms of, you know, you do it because you know, control is that, you know, if you don't turn up to any meetings and you've got 51% of the shares, then the people who've got 49% of the shares decide what's going on, you know, so you have control whether you decide to exercise it or not. So in a sort of, again, a layperson's perspective, I would still say that if you have the ability to have control, and I think that's supposed to be in those definitions again. But if you have the ability to have control, then you have control essentially. Whether you choose to exercise it or not is, is another factor.
Yeah. Good point. So that makes it a lot simpler. You can just say, well, control is control, whether it's exercised or not. It's a right to do things, and that right exists whether or not it's exercised.
Yeah, and I think that thing talks about the ability to do things, and if you have the ability to do it, whether it's via an option that you exercise, then that's the control.
Yeah, it's still control. It's still the same kind of control. Good. That's a great insight. Good. Now, on the chat, I've got a thing from Mary Stevens by email. Applies equally to current debate on ownership, control by contract as opposed to ownership. The bank controls a special purpose entity through management contract type arrangements that cannot own any of it if the purpose is to be achieved. Example of control by contract a securitization vehicle controlled by a bank but not be owned by the bank, otherwise it could not be off the balance sheet. Ah, yes. That do you have voice, Murray, or are you able to speak?
No, I don't believe he does.
His ideas are coming. Right. Okay. Thanks, Carol. Thanks for passing on his email. Well, that's a really interesting one, and it's going to feed directly into our SPV model. But before we do, it does answer some of the question about de facto control, I think. Let me just put a little pointer to that. Correct me if I got it wrong and it's not de facto control, for example, but because a special purpose vehicle or special purpose entity is created to take things off the balance sheet, but it has an entity which is the sponsor. No, that's controlled by contract, so it's still de jure control, isn't it? That's right. Good. This de facto control, is that really just a sort of a judgment call, or is it one that arises from some of the webs of influence we talked about before with common shareholders and things? Because the special purpose vehicle scenario that Murray just sent in still refers explicitly to a contractual agreement between presumably the sponsoring entity and the special purpose vehicle. Of course, the thing is off balance sheet, which couldn't be achieved if there was some voting share ownership, and so you have control by contract instead. So if we consider de jure control as being then maybe further subdivided into control by voting shares and control by contract and so on, then at the most general we're able to say, well, this refers to all of those, refers to any de jure control which can be asserted based on the existence of any contract and so on. Good. So I think that hangs together. Good. As you say, I've written a lot of notes down and not really moved much around in the model because the ideas are coming thick and fast here, and I'm trying to make sure we can generalize things up the chain properly. So we've got an answer on our hierarchies of agnostic ownership. They do exist as information, even though they would then be used to draw inferences on control. So our ownership, I don't think we need banded types of concept like parent and so on, though, do we? I think those terms are very well defined as being control based. What we simply have is assertions of who owns what shares, which is already a shareholder. We've already defined registered versus beneficial shareholder or beneficial owner. So I think what we're hearing is, so the question came up on the operational ontology sessions was that where we had all these parents and subsidiaries and wholly owned, total owners, wholly owned subsidiaries and so on, was there a second almost similar parallel set of those in the realm of just ownership? And the answer I'm hearing is no, there are not. There's information which asserts only ownership and from which you may or may not infer these control relationships, but there's only one set of meanings in play around these kinds of party, and that is control. I think, does anybody disagree with that conclusion from everything we've heard?
So are you saying that when we're talking about parents and so on, that those are fundamentally just control relationships? Is that what you're saying,
yes.
Mike? Yeah,
yes.
I think I agree with that.
Great, thanks. Now, of course, I renamed parent. We agreed that it was a bad term because it means so many different things. We renamed the one that referred explicitly to 50% ownership as being a 50% owned person. Owned or owning, in fact. That should be. Good. Now, this goes back then to the earlier question, which I think we answered with these SEC definitions, was to call something a parent, to call it a subsidiary, to call it a 50% owned person, or whatever other terms, and we were looking at some of these definitions in this website here. a parent if we specify a person is an affiliate controlling such person directly or indirectly through one or more intermediaries. There's control again as the key thing. This seems to be that the term applies right the way up to legal personhood, and not just to incorporated companies, not just to bodies corporate. Am I right in thinking it doesn't apply where there's not legal personhood? So all of the relationships that we've talked about, that the SEC has these definitions for, that are on this website and so on, don't only apply among incorporated companies, although the mechanisms by which, one of the mechanisms by which they apply relates to incorporated companies, the others relating to general partner equity, which is controlling equity, related to contract, which is another de jure mechanism. The sum of all those brings us all the way up to, well, logically, to formal organisation, but the legal definitions we're getting bring us directly and only to legal person. What would it be if, for example, a trust that is a fund owns more than 50% of something? Or the example from some years ago where the Kuwait Investment Office, on behalf of the state of Kuwait, a sovereign entity, owned more than 50% of British Airways, and people got very excited about it. Was that a parent or not? Or maybe parent was the word we decided not to use. Was it a? But it was still a 50% owning party, wasn't it? Because we got rid of the question by getting rid of the word parent.
But is the intent to use a parent as a determining independent variable, or as some type of result of a calculation saying that these are the parents, as opposed to based? I'm not sure how a parent is to be used in the context of recording facts or simply recording observations.
Right, or potentially both. That's a very good question. So if somebody asserts this is a parent in an SEC filing versus somebody looks at the percentage shareholding, eliminates the possibility of other contracts existing, and infers, either by manually looking or by running a semantic technology application, infers that that is a parent. If it means the same thing, it means the same thing. So
I'm not familiar with the filing for if someone says they're a parent or not, if that's actually part of how you might file, as opposed to saying you're wholly owned or whatever. But it seems to me that the only way that saying you're a parent would make sense is if what you're saying is it's a synonym for 100% ownership. And that's just my own gut reaction.
Well, 100%, not 50%.
Well, once again, it's the gray area for what if you're using saying I'm a parent as being the input fact, then you have no percentage that you don't, unless you say I'm a 60% parent.
So Jeff, I would read this in two ways. In that you're right. I mean, I think it depends on the on who and what is doing the reporting and how and the context in terms of reporting. So, typically if you're looking at a UK company's annual report, it might say we are a wholly owned, or we are controlled by, or some other legal term. It won't really be talking about parents.
Right.
However, there's loads of context, including in the the immediate FSB LEI work, where they are talking about immediate or ultimate parents, essentially, and
yes.
and I have seen other contexts, including things like EPA data, for example, where entities have to relate or the U.S. Small Business Administration, some of their stuff, they have to report parent information. Now, that's a little bit uncomfortable for us in terms of putting that in, because we don't really know what they mean by parent, and it's not always clear, and it's not really there's a good definition, and it can be matched with other things. But nevertheless, it is something that will be reported, and the definition that we're probably going to use, in absence of anything else, is a parent is something is that that definition in the ECFR document that we discussed at the beginning, which is it is something that exercises, it is something that exercises control over an entity.
Yeah, fair enough. I'm just saying that I'm trying to get away from using the notion of parent, whereby whether immediate or ultimate, as itself an input fact, apart from without being otherwise qualified, because it's not fungible. It does not lend itself to being able to.
No, you don't have any disagreement from me there. It's just a question of, what we wouldn't want to have to do is to say, okay, this information that these people are reporting or that this is coming from this source, we can't do anything with because it's using something that we'd rather not use, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. If that's the only information available, then one must infer what it means, and perhaps what we should say, if all we have from the sources is they say that this is a parent, is we perhaps have in fact a particular relationship operator that says is a parent, and we can infer from that either 51% or 100% based upon what we want to.
Yeah.
But we are actually not straying from the fact that all that was reported was somebody saying that they had a parent.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
We need a relationship and a party that is the thing in that relationship, which is a less well specified. It's still a control relationship, isn't it? Because it's,
well, yeah, Mike. Where I've been going with this is simply trying to record facts using some type of assertion syntax, meaning, you could say party A owns such a percentage of party B, followed by the value, or party A has so many shares of party B, followed by value, and one of the operators that might be defined in this assertion grammar for recording facts at various levels of granularity might be party A says they're a parent of party B or is a parent of party B without saying 51% or 100%.
Yeah.
Or indeed whether it's direct or indirect.
Correct. If all you have is the fact that they say they are a parent, then you record that fact as being in fact the operator that is the the operative fact in the statement.
Yeah. So sometimes somebody might report that they're a parent, and you wouldn't have detected it because there's 30% shares through this intermediary and 21% shares through that intermediary, and you may not even see them both, and only by adding them together would you infer it, but they've already told you it, and therefore this is what they've told you.
Right, and you'd have to get all of the folks together in a room to figure out if you had the case where, say, the rights to the producers have been sold doubly.
But most people in the market don't work this out for themselves anyway, right? They're going to get this information from a vendor. So we need to provide the parent and ultimate parent things that the vendor can use. There's a separate question about how the vendor communicates to the users the methodology by which they come up with that. And I know that different vendors don't have exactly the same rules now, so they may not in the future either. We'll see.
Meaning, therefore, they might mean different things by it, but they are asserting something.
They might mean subtly different things, and there is that issue that anyone has now. So it would be nice if they could annotate the stuff they send somehow with the parameters that define their interpretation of what makes a parent. But
which we've now defined so that it becomes physically possible to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, and the points that I were making were in context of having, for example, the LEI relationship data system recording these facts that would then become public information to the end users without requiring interpretation by the vendor.
Yes. Exactly. So at least if we're able to formally say what something means, even if not everybody's data is up to it, you know what is meaningfully asserted and what is not. So I think the main really strong innovation on this today is the introduction of contract-based de jure control versus share-based de jure control, and the ability to say when both are being asserted and when only one or the other is being asserted, or when neither is being really asserted, or something else might be in place. Yes, and it all relates back to either you're asserting de jure control or you're not. Good. Okay, I think, Tony, you hit on, I think, what's to me become a very interesting point. Thinking when we look at the semantic technology stuff, we look at what you can infer. When you look at data visualization, you look at how you can create visualizations and allow humans to infer stuff. But there's the question coming the other way, that when information comes in from a vendor, what do they already mean by it? And that includes formal semantics that may not be data related. It may include, rights and controls and options and all the rest of it being asserted. And so one still needs to be able to reason over those and distinguish among them for disambiguation of different kinds of relationships.
I mean, it's certainly one of the big issues that people face in practice, because they will take feeds from multiple vendors, not the least of which because no single vendor has complete coverage over all of the different entities that you want. I was just looking this morning at a table of fund coverage from different entities, different providers, and nobody has it all. So you have to pull in these different sets, and either you or someone else has to aggregate them. But one of the things that makes it harder for us to do the aggregation ourselves and forces us to use aggregation services is the fact that at the moment there is no well-defined way for the vendors to communicate to us the real semantics of what's in each field, so that we know which things should be the same and which things should be different.
Oh, so they might have the semantics, but not a clear way of communicating it to you.
Well, yeah, and then we'd have to get them to actually do it. But at the moment, they just send you, often a big flat file with a lot of fields, and then a PDF that describes what each field is. Well, it can be a huge effort across hundreds of fields to, work out when two fields from two vendors should really be the same or not. We often end up comparing them by using data mining tools that just compare the values between the different columns and see whether they look like the same values or not. But it's not ideal.
Interesting. So if the data is the same, it probably means the same thing, and if it's hugely different, it probably meant something totally different, and that's the first clue you get about it. That's a really interesting point. Good. So then it seems we've got some clarity on this. Should parent and so on be based on the identity being just another incorporated company? I'd always assumed that to be a parent one had to at least be a company, but having got rid of the word parent, and we're talking about 50% owned parent person and so on, this relationship now, which I'd anticipated would float up as far as formal organisation, actually floats up as far as almost anything that can be a potential party, right? If you can own shares, you can participate in these kinds of relationships, even if the label of parent might only be used for some. That's just a labeling question. Am I making sense? I made this thing tidy. Anyway.
I haven't had my coffee yet. I can't tell.
Right. Yeah, so in fact this relationship then becomes more or less redundant because it's anything that, I'm just trying to get that line where we could see it cleanly. Okay, good. So this, I think all this SEC stuff over here and the stuff on the website has been the most useful in working out how far to promote these relationships that we previously put in specifically around incorporated companies, because that's where they were unambiguous, and we've moved them up to different kinds of ownership and control. Okay, let me show you something I've done, which, where is it? Yes. No, okay, I just want to look at a couple of things on the relationship between certain kinds of equity and control. Just bear with me while I find the diagram that I was looking at when, here we are. So I created a new diagram with just the equity. Remember, we tried to generalize, there's a few gaps here, and here's where I want to pick up the comments from the UCC folks from last week as well, I think. We tried to take from these specific shareholder and voting shareholder type of relationships around limited companies. We looked at similar ones around partnerships. We noted that partnership equity is equity with control. General partners hold partnership equity, limited partners don't. So I've defined something called controlling equity, and I've also, previously we had the accounts equation, we had equity in the financial part of the model, then we had the accounting equation that relates liabilities, assets, debt, equity, and additional paid-in capital. And we had that as stockholder equity, but I had stockholder equity as being only related to limited companies. I've renamed that to shareholder equity. I've added in stockholder equity and talked about how both the shareholder equity based on shares in a limited company and the partnership equity based on a partnership, whether it's incorporated or unincorporated. So there's a bit of thinking still to do there, but then I added in controlling equity. We need to be able to talk about, for example, is general partner equity controlling equity? We've put that it is because that's what we agreed last time. So I've explicitly linked. These used to be completely unconnected. The equity hierarchy, the kinds of ownership and the kinds of control were completely unconnected. I've defined a relationship that can exist between a kind of equity, which would be like a logical union of some of these others, and a kind of control, namely the jure control. So firstly, does that work? Any comments? And then I wanted to go back and address some of the comments from the folks at UCC about some of our use of terminology.
Mike, just a quick question about, I mean, the use of equity as a term, it may be more prevalent as an indication of, say, shareholder equity in terms of control. Equity, of course, is also completely overloaded in the accounting concept of being the difference between liabilities and assets. And so it may be that the term equity itself is introducing the same kind of confusion that the term parent does in some sense, that it's got multiple uses. So if you're trying to use equity as a form of an expression of percentages of participation either in ownership of beneficial interests, economic value, or control, it probably should be qualified to certainly be distinct from any interpretation of equity in the sense of capital, or in the equity that is what is the calculation that is the difference between assets and liabilities.
I had assumed they were the same. Right. Thank you. That maybe.
Well, I think they may be interpreted the same in a large majority of situations, but I don't think the use of the term equity is far broader than just the use as shareholder equity.
Right. So this is where we asked last time or the time before whether equity as a word is synonymous with ownership, and we agreed that it was, and that you didn't have to be an incorporated entity, such as a limited company or an incorporated partnership, to have equity, because the general partners in an unincorporated partnership also have equity. Is that an example of the kind of equity that doesn't mean the same thing as the difference between liability and assets on the balance sheet of that organization?
Right. I mean, the term equity itself on its own is not that narrowly defined. It's much more broadly defined.
Right. So we need to split out the accounting, because originally I used the accounts equation as a way of framing the formal definition of equity. This is when we did the models just of shares, long before we got into business entities at all. So since then, this equity taxonomy has kind of multiplied out into several different facets. Right. So the stockholder equity in the accounts equation versus equity in the general sense of what something, what it may mean to own part of something. We need to break some connection here.
I think you have to look at the etymology of the concept of shares and equity, in the sense that if you have a public corporation that involved with shares, and you have shareholders, then the notion of that would mean that those shareholders share in the equity of the corporation to the extent the corporation has equity in the accounting sense, meaning it's a going concern and is not insolvent, at which point it would be disbanded. And so I think the original concept it makes sense from how the term equity meant to include shareholder equity as being that percentage of the equity that you own by owning the shares. But in terms of the accounting relationship, just to use it as to switch it around and say that the term equity is definitional of control is probably cart before the horse.
Right. So rather than talking about some kind of equity as having a relationship to some kind of control, you're saying that oversimplifies what we even meant by entity here. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, once again, it's the problem with the vernacular and it's the same. Different jurisdictions have different uses, but certainly the word and the concept equity gets has many different uses. You can talk about the equity participation in a private venture like a special purpose vehicle in which the equity participants are the ones that put up the capital, and capital is viewed as some form of equity share that is the insurance for the undertaking, and that's yet another different definition of equity apart from the traditional equity is what's left over after liabilities to make up assets.
And we saw just now that with a special purpose vehicle, the control is not exercised via any controlling equity because the equity in that sense is off your balance sheet by definition. Otherwise, so the sponsor of an SPV exercises some control, exercises via a contract, not via equity. But you're saying that it has equity participation in some other non-shareholding sense.
Special purpose vehicles that are set up will have sponsors that will put in a certain amount of capital in order to basically have economic capital and a degree of insurance against loss and risk, and that economic capital is often viewed as being an equity stake in the vehicle, and it's been described in those senses as well. It's really the piece that is most at risk, and often has some determination of which cash flows one gets from the rules of that vehicle, if that vehicle is something like a tranched instrument that has different rules for principal and interest based upon different types of participation. So it's just a very overloaded term.
Yeah, so in other words, you might have several sponsors of a tranched asset-backed security, and they've all put money in. They've not done it as shares. If the thing goes bust, they've lost all that money. It's not controlling equity. There's separate control in some contract, but that contract is going to say, in return for having put this amount in, which is at risk if it fails, you get this set of returns from this pool of the asset-backed security.
Correct. Those would be part of the conditions for the different types of participation in the cash flows that would go through the vehicle.
Yeah. That will all be defined in the contract. So you've got economic interest. So again, we have economic interest defined in a contract.
And partnership equity in the traditional partnership sense is more closely aligned to percentages of control as well as participation. Partnership equity is, if you wanted to cash out or be bought out of a partnership, that's how much you'd have to be paid, and then also your percentage of that partnership equity reflects your participation in the income, expense, and liabilities of the partnership. So it just means different things in different contexts.
Right, so I can maybe come up with a more general way of thinking of equity in that sense of how much you've put in versus the more mechanized kinds of equity. Now, this is where I'm starting to be aware that some of the folks from UCC came in with some very interesting feedback from last time. Leona and your colleagues, are you there? Are they? Are you got sound? If not, I can read your email from last time. You were clarifying some of our terminology and so on. Oh, and I've just realised we're over the half hour. Okay, I'll attach those notes, but basically it was helping us clarify some of the wording that we've been using, and I've realised that we're just straying into the same area now. Carol has called time. Thank you, Carol. For some reason I thought it was still 20 past. Good, well thank you everybody. Any last minute comments before we wrap it up? Well, awfully quiet. Excellent. I can hear a noise. I thought I'd lost the internet for a minute. Thank you all very much indeed. I'll get this all written up Monday or Tuesday, not before then, and I'll have another go at generalising these relationships as appropriately as we can. I think we've got a lot of clarity on some of the stuff we needed. Really appreciate your time and input as ever, and we'll meet again at the same time next week.
All right, Mike, thanks.
Thank you very much. Take care. Carol, shall I end this, or do you want to end it?
I will. I didn't know whether you have the that URL. Have you got it locally?
Ooh, good question.
Let me copy it to you. Let me copy it to you before I end it.
Lovely, thanks.
No
yeah,
problem.
Oh yeah, he sent it to me in the chat, so that's good. Yeah, because that's right. The reason I forgot to follow that last time was that